Good morning. My name's Eric, and once the lights show up, you can see me, and that's good. You can see I'm wearing a shirt that says Big Chill, and it's not in reference to the temperature in the room, okay? That's not why I'm wearing this. It's because this weekend we're doing an event with Whitewater Crossing, and the student ministry is going over there, and last night was our silent disco, and we had a lot of fun jamming out to some tunes. Singing at the top of our lungs, Journey, Speaking of journeys, has this ever happened to you where you look at the number of books that you have, and there's some sitting on the floor, and you're like, I need a bookcase. I need a bookshelf to hold these books. Because that happens to me sometimes, and I'm like, I need a bookshelf, and I don't know what to do. And then the bright idea pops up in my head. Oh, I know where to find a cheap bookcase. IKEA, right? And so you're all excited. You get in the car, and you're driving. You drive 45 minutes or however long it takes to get there, and you get there, and you see the big sign, and you're like, this is amazing. I'm going to get a bookshelf for $5, and it's going to fall apart in a year or so, and it's going to be great. But you walk into IKEA, and you're all excited to get started, and you go up the escalator, and you just immediately become overwhelmed because there's so many things. And so you have to seek out somebody. You have to find somebody to help you figure out what to do because you can't read Swedish, right? And so you're looking around for somebody. You find a store clerk, and they come and they help you, and they're like, okay, well, this is what you do. You got to get a little piece of paper, and you got to get your paper measuring tape and measure things, and you got to write down the name, include the umlauts or whatever on there, and then you write down the number, and then you'll make your way down to the warehouse, and there. You've been in IKEA at this point for 17 hours, right? And there is where all of your emotions catch up with you, and you start to weep because you can't find the aisle, you can't find the number, and when you do find the number, the shelf is empty, and you have to go over a couple other places in order to find the thing that you wanted. And it doesn't look like you think it should look. It's like way flatter than you think it should look, but you pick it up and you wrestle it into your cart, and the wheels go all over the place, and you're trying not to hit anybody. You're trying not to knock things over, but you get to the line, you buy your item, and you return home victorious. It's quite a journey, right? It's quite a journey. And in every journey that we take, there's a moment, like in the warehouse, where you hit a wall. Where you hit this spot where all of your emotions catch up with you, and you break down in tears. And you're like, I'm going to be in the store for another 10 hours. I know this is true, right? You start to think, what did I get myself into? And that happens on every journey. Every journey has a wall, someplace in the middle where you have to choose one of three things. You can choose to continue on in your journey. You can maybe back up a little bit in your journey and try to find another route. Or you can just give up. We know this story really well. It's a story that we tell ourselves over and over and over again. In fact, literary critics have come together and they said, hey, listen, this is the story that we tell. It's like the one story that we tell over and over and over again. It's the hero's journey. There's a call to adventure, excitement for a new adventure, for a new journey. You have to find a mentor, a store clerk to help you through the journey. Normally, the store clerks at IKEA don't have the giant white beard, but in the hero's journey, usually they do, right? And then you have to go through some tests and find your allies and your enemies. You have to grow a little bit. But there's a moment where you have to face the innermost cave, where you have to go into that warehouse And you know that in that warehouse, you're going to see the wall, the ordeal, the thing that's going to prevent you from continuing on in your journey if you don't go through it. But we know the story, right? Because after the ordeal is the reward and the return home. After the ordeal, you are a changed person and you go home victorious. But the wall is never a fun place to be. It's in every journey. It's in every journey that we take. It's in marriage. We hear about the 7-year itch, and psychologists have said it's actually more like a 3-year itch, where you get to this point where you know that person well enough to know that there are things that person does that you don't like so much, right? The puppy love has kind of worn off, and you kind of have to face the reality of who that other person is and who you are in relation to that other person. And when you hit that wall, you have a choice. You can either continue to go on forward, you can give up on the journey altogether, or you can kind of go back to an earlier stage in the journey and try to reroute your journey. The problem is, no matter how you reroute it, it's always going to end in a wall. There's always going to be a wall. There's always going to be an ordeal. It happens with marriage. It happens with parenthood. It happens with our careers, right? I mean, it happens just with life. That's what we call a midlife crisis, right? Every journey has a wall. Every journey has several walls that we have to get past in order to get to the reward, in order to get to the end. But the wall is always a crisis. It's always some place where your simple answers start to fail you. The simple things that you knew before start to kind of disintegrate and not sound like they work anymore. They start to sound simple and hollow. One of the things that we've said from stage often here is, with Jesus, better is possible. And you might hear that and you might be like, that's awesome, that's true, I've experienced it. You might hear that when you're in the middle of a crisis and you're saying, yeah, but how is being with Jesus better when I'm in the hospital bed? How is being with Jesus better when I'm at the side of the hospital bed, where my loved one is suffering? How is being with Jesus better in the crisis, in the wall situation? Our answers start to fail us. How is being with Jesus better when you're looking for the right time to tell your spouse that you've been laid off? How is being with Jesus better when you've been betrayed, abandoned, and alone? How is it better when you know that you let somebody down? How is it better when you're in the car on the way home from the graveside service? Our simple answers start to fail us when we reach the wall. And it happens in every journey. In fact, my wife used to bake wedding cakes. She no longer does it because that's the most stressful thing you could ever possibly do. Not only do you have to make this beautiful thing that tastes great and looks awesome, but you have to transport it as well. You have to put it in a car and hope that it doesn't fall apart, right? It's the most stressful thing you could possibly do, but there was always a point while she was decorating a cake where she would just break down. And she would say, I can't finish this cake. It looks stupid. It's awful. It's horrible. And she would sit down on the kitchen floor, and I'd have to sit with her and say, no, you've done it before. Keep going. Keep going. We started to call that the middle of the cake syndrome. In every project, every journey, there's a middle of the cake. In fact, there's a Harvard professor who described this in something that they called Cantor's Law. And what that is everything looks like a failure in the middle. And we're in a series as we're walking through the book of Mark. We're kind of restarting the series after taking a break. We're going to go through chapters 11 through 16. But my job today is to kind of recap where we've been, to kind of go back to where we started, chapters 1 through 10, and kind of give a preview of where we're going, right? And so what we see, as I was kind of reading through Mark, and I was like, what am I going to talk about here? One of the things that stuck out to me is that really the book of Mark is a journey that Jesus' disciples are on with Jesus. And what's weird about the book of Mark is it ends at the wall, at the ordeal. We go into the innermost cave. Jesus is being crucified, right? He dies, and then it it ends at the empty tomb. Like everybody runs away and they're afraid and they're terrified. All of the disciples are fleeing for their lives. They're afraid. And the question that Mark leaves us with is, what are you going to do about the wall? What are you going to do about the fact that Jesus died? What are you going to do about the fact of the empty grave? And so that's what we're talking about today, is the journey that the disciples are on. Now, one of the things that we established in the Mark series is Art Time with Eric, and so we're not abandoning that. Okay, so if you would go ahead and grab your Mark Bible journals and turn to page 60. Because that's kind of where we're going to be for part of the thing there. And so turn to page 60, and on the blank side of the page, I want you to draw a picture. Okay, it's a really hard one this time. Let me turn on my pen. Draw a giant A. It's like that. Pretty difficult, right? Now, it's an easy one. When we're at the wall, we want answers. A stands for answers. We want the way to get through the wall, but our simple answers just kind of fail us when we get there. And so what we see as we follow the disciples through their story is we see them walking through this journey. We see them walking through what we call the critical journey. I read a book, and it kind of helped me make sense of what the disciples are going through, and it uses a little bit of the hero's journey to describe it, but it talks about the different stages of faith, of a faith journey. And so the first stage on your picture, you can write the number 1 down at the bottom. The first stage is awe. Awe. And this is where you first meet Jesus. You first discover that Jesus has something that nobody else has. We see John the Baptist in the passage that Brady read earlier. We see John the Baptist preaching to everybody, hey, Jesus is here, the Messiah is here. He's going to be the one that's going to lead us, right? And the disciples hear this, and they're kind of intrigued. And the very next thing that we see is Jesus comes up to Peter and Andrew and to James and John. He says, follow me. And they're so excited that they just drop their nets and they follow Jesus. And we see many, many stories after that where it just talks about how amazed everybody is. Everybody's in awe of what Jesus can do, of his authority, of his miracles, all of that sort of thing. And then stage 2 is doing. So Jesus kind of starts to get the disciples to do things, right? He takes them up on a mountain. He appoints the 12 as his apostles, right? And he says, okay, all right, now you're going to start doing some things, right? And in our faith journeys, what that looks like a lot of times is doing things that, the church says are good for your spiritual growth. And so you're all excited about following Jesus, and you're like, how do I do this? And so you rely on mentors, you rely on leaders, you rely on preachers to kind of point you in the right direction. Oh, do this thing. Go to small groups. Do the if gathering. Like we tell you these different things that you can do to kind of help you on your journey. Go to the next page. Find your next step, right? This is the doing stage, right? And then, that's weird. All right. Then number 3 is the gift stage. This is where you start to find out that you have something to offer the church, right? It's not just, I'm going to do what the church tells me to do. It's, I've got something really special and really important that I need to share with the people around me, right? And you're still excited at this point. You're still wanting to do the best that you can possibly do to follow Jesus. And so you kind of start to step into a leadership role of some sort. And then number 4 is kind of a question point. This is the innermost cave in the hero's journey. This is chapter 8 where Jesus asks the disciples, hey, who do you say that I am? And they have to kind of struggle with this dichotomy in their heads where it's like, well, you're the Messiah. And Jesus keeps saying, yeah, I'm going to Jerusalem and I'm going to die. And they're like, this doesn't match up. We don't know what's going on here. And if you look over at the text here on this page, I think that there's a story that kind of brought this all together for me. And it's a story of the rich man. And so we're going to start in verse 17 of chapter 10 here. And I'm just going to read. As Jesus was starting out on his way to Jerusalem, so Jesus is about to kind of take that next step towards his death by going to Jerusalem, a man came running up to him and knelt down and asked, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" We see the excitement, right? We see kind of stage 1. We see stage 2, where he's following Jesus. He wants to do what Jesus wants him to do, and he's like, "How do I do it?" And so Jesus says this: "Why do you call me good? Only God is truly good. But to answer your question, you know the commandments. You must not murder. You must not commit adultery. You must not steal. You must not testify falsely. You must not cheat anyone. Honor your father and mother." And the young man's like, "Teacher." The man replied, "I've obeyed all these commandments since I was young." He's doing the stuff that he needs to do, right? He's following all of the rules. He's got some of the answers in place, and he's starting to operate his life in response to those answers. On the next page, it says, looking at the man, Jesus felt genuine love for him. He felt genuine love for him. There's still one thing you haven't done. There's still one thing you haven't done. Jesus says, look, you've got something. And I want you to use that to bless other people. He says, go and sell all of your possessions and give the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And then come follow me. At this, the man's face fell, and he went away sad, for he had many possessions. Jesus looked around and said to his disciples, "How hard is it for a rich to enter the kingdom of God?" This amazed them, but Jesus said again, "Dear children, it is very hard to enter the kingdom of God. In fact, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God." And I think what Jesus is doing here is he's building a wall right in front of that rich man. He's building a wall right there. He's saying, this is something that you have to do. And the rich young man is like, I can't, like Jesus says, it's easier for a camel to go through an eye of a needle. It's easier for a man to walk through a wall than to follow Jesus. right? It's easier for this man to walk through a wall. And how can we walk through a wall? And so what the young man decides to do, instead of following Jesus, he's at that ordeal, he's at that wall, and so he chooses to go back, right? He either abandons the journey altogether, or he goes back to a place and a time where he felt secure in his relationship with God, right? Maybe he went back to following the commandments, not following Jesus. When we hit the wall, we have a choice. We can continue to go forward, find a way through the wall. We can give up on the journey altogether, or we can go back to a place of security. Because the place at the wall is not a place of security. It's a place of questions. It's a place of tension. It's a place of hardship, right? But we know from the hero's journey, we know from the story that we tell over and over and over again, we know from our own lives that when we walk through that wall, however we get through that wall, there's reward on the other side. There's something better on the other side of it. And I think what happens when we start to follow Jesus is it starts to fundamentally change what we think it means to follow Jesus. Let me say that again. When we follow Jesus, it fundamentally changes what we think it means to follow Jesus. Because at the beginning, what we think it means is that we just get to have a big party and with Jesus better as possible. We cling on to that. Better life, better community, better purpose. And that's true. But as you start to follow Jesus, as you start to kind of do the things that people are telling you to do, this is how you grow closer to Jesus, you start to realize that the better looks a little bit different than you thought it looked at first. When you start to use your gifts and when you start to kind of take leadership and ownership of your relationship with Jesus, you start to realize that following Jesus looks a little bit different than you thought it did at the beginning. And especially when you hit that wall, when you start that journey towards the questions and that sort of thing, that's when you start to realize that's not about rules. It's about relationship with Jesus. It's not about rules, it's about relationship. It's not about doing the right things. It's about being a child of God. It's not about working your way. It's not about like disassembling a wall or building a wall or any of that stuff. It's about resting in Jesus' provision and in his grace. It's not about answers. It's about what's the right direction. What's the right direction? So on your picture there, just go ahead and draw an arrow right at the top of it. Because that's what we need. We need direction. Jesus gives the disciples a preview of what's about to happen. He says over and over and over again, I'm going to go to Jerusalem. They're going to kill me. And they don't get it. And they don't get it. And they don't get it. It's only when they experience it that they start to get it. It's only when they see Jesus hanging on the cross, it's only when they see the empty tomb that they realize that following Jesus isn't what they thought it was going to be. What they thought it was going to be was he was going to go into Jerusalem triumphant and take out the Roman rule. But that wasn't it. He was going to go into Jerusalem and he was going to deal with the real problem, death and sin. And so what we learn from this journey that the disciples take throughout the book of Mark is this. It's not about listening to sermons, right? If you look at the book of Mark, one of the things that you'll see is John the Baptist preaches, right? Chapter 1 is full of words like proclaiming and preaching. The rest of Mark is devoid of preaching. It's devoid of proclamation. It's all about following. It's all about following. It's not about knowing the right answers, because the rich young ruler knew the right answers. It's about following Jesus. It's not about being perfect. The disciples were certainly not perfect. It's not about going to church. It's not about doing all of the right things. It's about following Jesus through to the end of the journey. Following Jesus your whole life, however far that takes you on that journey, right? Whether you're in step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5, step 6, wherever you are on that journey, it's there. You're there to develop and mature and to grow into the next pieces. And they kind of overlap sometimes, and you go back and forth between different stages and that sort of thing in your life. But it's about a lifelong pursuit of Jesus. Psalm 1 says, when we meditate on God's word over and over and over through a lifetime, we start to grow in our obedience. We start to grow in our understanding and in our relationship with God. But it doesn't stop. There's always deeper to go. There's always another step to take. And so in a few short weeks, as we kind of explore the book of Mark, we'll start to see the disciples ask this question: did I just waste the last 3 years of my life following this man? They're going to hit the wall. And, I don't know where you're at on your journey. I don't know if you're in stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, whatever. None of the stages are bad places to be. Right? Just like it's not a bad thing to be an infant, right? It's just it's the development stage, right? It's not a bad thing to be a child. It's not a bad thing to be an adolescent. What's bad is when we refuse to move beyond those stages of development. When we hit the wall and we say, I'm just going to go back to something that feels good. When we hit the wall and we just kind of go back to what's secure and what's safe. And so, wherever you're at in your journey, what we need to do is we just need to start walking. Start looking for chances to develop. Start looking for mentors who can help us. Start looking for the gifts that we have to share and starting to share them with everybody else. And then once we start walking, the challenge is to keep walking, right? Don't be afraid of what lies ahead of you. Don't be afraid of the truth, right? Explore the truth to the depths that you can explore the truth, because you're not going to stretch it beyond its limits, because it's truth, right? So keep asking questions and surrender. Surrender your quest for answers. Start looking for where God is and go there. That's how we keep walking. It's not, I need the right answers. It's, where is God and how can I get there? How can I get closer to him? You can't walk through walls, right? That's impossible. But Jesus can. And so in order to walk through that wall, we need to rely on him and we need to follow him through it. Surrender your guilt. Surrender your shame. It's just going to hold you back. Surrender your entire life, your entire self to him. Just keep walking. Keep walking. And the third thing is, start walking, keep walking, don't walk alone. Don't walk alone. If you're a female, go to the If Gathering thing. Make some friends who are pursuing Jesus like you're pursuing Jesus. If you're in small groups, invest fully in them. Be vulnerable there. Invest your life in the people in your group. And if you're not a part of either one of those things, here's a simple step you can take today. Look around you. Learn somebody else's name. Don't walk alone. Connect, root into this place, into this body of believers, because they'll help you get through the wall. Following Jesus leads you to places that you never thought you would go. It led the disciples to the cross. They never thought they would go there. But they kept walking. And they kept walking together. Where would God want to take this church? If we would just let him. If we've surrendered our lives fully to him. If we would let go of our insecurity, let go of our pride, and fully surrendered our hearts. Fully surrendered our lives, this building, our very selves, to his service. How could he not just make our lives better? But how would his love seep out into the community around us? What would happen if your neighbor knew that they could come to you in their most desperate situation when they're hitting the wall? And they would know that you would respond with love and grace and practical help. What would happen if your family knew that when you faced a crisis, that there were people here who are willing to walk with you through that crisis, willing to cook you meals, willing to walk with you through the wall? What would happen is if every person in this room devoted themselves to the word and following Jesus, no matter what the cost? What would happen if you didn't have to worry about the dark places in your journey? Because you knew that God stood in the darkest place in human history for you. God was working out the rescue plan that restored us back into a right relationship with him. Could you come today and surrender your quest for answers? Can you come today and surrender your pride, your insecurity, your guilt, your shame? Can you surrender yourself to follow Jesus through that wall? We're going to sing a song here in just a second. And when we sing that song, if you want to surrender, I want to challenge you to respond physically in some way, shape, or form. There's several different ways you can do that. You can come up to the front. There will be the prayer team up here. They'd be happy to pray with you. You can come and kneel at the foot of the stage. We don't often do that in our tradition, but you're able to do that. You could respond by saying, hey, I want to surrender my whole life through baptism. Come up and we'll make that happen. Or maybe you just want to raise your hands and surrender and say, I want to surrender everything to you. So as we sing, I just challenge you to respond physically to what Jesus is doing in your heart.